Hello and welcome to my presentation on the perceptions of cognitive and affective empathetic statements by socially assistive robots. I am Chris Birmingham and my co-authors are Ashley Perez and Maja Mataric. To start, I'd like to introduce empathy, an individual's capacity to respond to the emotions of others. We use empathy to build connections to one another by understanding and responding to one another's thoughts and feelings. As robots and conversational agents begin to have a complex interaction with humans, they will also need the capacity to understand and respond with empathy to the thoughts and feelings of humans. Computational empathy can support the development of social relationships between humans and robots, which is essential for socially assistive robots and social robots more generally. As with human empathy, computational empathy must be communicated clearly and perceived as empathetic in order to be effective. While the form empathy takes can vary greatly depending on the context, empathy can generally be understood through two broad categories or dimensions: cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to reason about and understand what another person's thoughts and feelings are. Affective empathy is the ability to have an affective or emotional response that is more appropriate to someone else's situation than to one's own. For example, feeling how they might feel or feeling for them. This work contributes a novel study of the differences in user perception of affective and cognitive empathetic statements made by a robot to an actor's disclosure. We report several findings, including that participants rate affective empathetic statements as more empathetic and more believable than cognitive empathetic statements, and that participants' belief in the interaction was highly correlated with the perceived empathy of the robot in both the affective and cognitive conditions, and that more negative attitudes towards robots were correlated with a higher rating of empathy in the cognitive condition than in the affective condition. We wanted to test two key ideas with this study. The first, H1, was that participants will rate the empathy of a robot that makes cognitive-based empathy statements higher than a robot that makes affective-based empathy statements. We believed that participants would be less likely to rate affective empathy statements higher than cognitive statements, because they would be less likely to believe that the robot was capable of feeling the emotions that it claimed it was feeling. H2 is that more negative attitudes towards robots will be correlated with higher ratings in the cognitive condition compared to the affective condition for both empathy and belief in the interaction. To test these ideas, we conducted a within-subject study with counterbalancing by condition, though not by demographic. The study was calculated with a significance of 0.05, a power of 0.8, and a Cohen's d of 0.4, with piloted data. Participants were recruited from Amazon Mechanical Turk. Not all the participants who started the survey completed the task. Those who did not complete the attention check were excluded from the study. The study was not able to balance by gender completely, as 3/4 were male. The average age was 36, and there were a variety of education levels. The recording setup can be seen here, with the male and female actors across from the QT robot. The setup was generally modeled to be viewed as a therapeutic interview session. Please see our paper for further details of the setup and for links to the software needed to replicate the study. As you will see in the video example, the study dialogue contains 3 parts. The first and last were spoken by the robot, and the middle was spoken by the actor. The gestures and facial expressions were identical for both conditions. The disclosures made by the actor were of 2 different emotions. One was feeling depressed and the other was feeling overwhelmed. I'll now show you an example.
Hey Isabel, it is good to see you. How are you doing today?
To be honest, I'm not doing so well. I'm feeling frustrated because I haven't been able to go outside and do anything for so long.
Thank you for sharing. I can totally relate to what you are feeling. I also feel frustration sometimes. Would you like to tell me more? We can talk more about why you are feeling frustrated.
We used a Likert scale to measure the participants' attitudes towards robots, their perceptions of empathy during the interaction, and their belief in the interaction's naturalness or the actor's distress and the robot response. During the interaction, the participants started with a demographic survey and a measure of their existing attitudes towards robots. We then used a sample video and asked basic factual questions to make sure that the participants were actually paying attention. Those that did not pass were excluded from the results. For those that passed, we watched 2 short videos of each condition, one male and one female, and then answered the questions about their perceptions of empathy and their belief in the interaction. After both conditions were completed, they then answered some open-form qualitative questions. Our first and primary result is that the perceived empathy was higher in the affective condition than the cognitive condition. We expected participants to find the idea that a robot could feel an emotion to be less believable than the idea that a robot could understand the feelings of a human, which we hypothesized in H1 would lead participants to rate the cognitive condition higher than the affective condition. Contrary to this expectation, we found that participants rated the robot that made the affective empathetic statements as significantly more empathetic than the robot that made the cognitive empathetic statements. The affective condition was rated significantly higher than the cognitive condition, showing a small to medium effect, about Cohen's d of 0.35 with an effect size of 0.17. Thus, H1 was not supported. One possible explanation for these surprising results can be found in the breakdown of our expectations. As shown in the lower figure, the expectation that the belief was strongly correlated with the perceived empathy is correct. However, the expectation that the belief in the cognitive condition would be higher was incorrect, as you can see in the top figure. As can be seen here, the NARS scores were negatively correlated with the empathy and belief measures, although they were positively correlated with the difference between the cognitive and affective conditions for both measures. In the affective condition, the negative correlation between the NARS and the empathy between the NARS and the belief measures was significant. In the cognitive condition, it was significantly correlated with the belief measure, but not with the empathy measure. So the difference between the two conditions on the far right here, the positive correlation was with the empathy measure was significant, but the belief measure was not. Therefore, we can say that H2A was supported and H2B is not supported. Now, to go back, the higher rating of affective condition may be an indication that affective empathy is generally perceived as more powerful than cognitive empathy. However, we found no evidence for this in the literature on empathy, and therefore this requires further investigation. Alternatively, however, the fact that the affective condition was rated higher may be explained by the correlation between the negative attitudes towards robots and the difference between the ratings of the empathy in the cognitive and affective condition. Participants in our study generally scored lower on the NARS, which correlated with a higher rating of empathy in the affective condition compared to the cognitive condition. As presented in the prior slide, participants' prior attitudes towards robots was correlated with the ratings of belief and empathy in the affective condition and with belief in the cognitive condition. This correlation shows how more negative attitudes towards robots predisposed participants to be less likely to believe in the interaction scenario and to rate the robot as less empathetic, regardless of condition. This correlation is stronger for ratings in the affective condition than in the cognitive condition. And there is a positive correlation between the NARS measure and the difference between the empathy ratings in the two conditions. This means that participants with more negative use of robots rated the empathy of the robot in the cognitive condition higher, as we expected. Therefore, H2A is supported. While there is a positive slope in the regression between the NARS and the difference in ratings between the two conditions, it is not significant, so H2B is not fully supported by the data. That H2A is supported while H2B is not supported, though, suggests that participants' prior attitudes towards robots was more important than the specific type of empathy that the robot was trying to convey in determining their belief in the interaction. This is intuitive in that the type of empathy conveyed was only one factor among many that participants may have incorporated into their belief rating, while it was probably the dominant factor in the rating of the robot's empathy. Please see the paper for additional details discussing the ethics and trade-offs of deception in HRI, the limitations of this study due to the use of Amazon Mechanical Turk, and the proposed future work exploring customizing empathetic responses based on prior attitudes towards robots. To summarize, in this work, we explore the perceptions of a robot's cognitive and affective empathy in response to a human's disclosure through a novel study. We asked participants to rate their perceptions of a robot's empathy on short videos of the robot giving cognitive and affective empathetic responses to disclosures about stress related to COVID-19 and the pandemic made by an actor. To rate the interaction, participants filled out a short survey and watched 2 videos demonstrating each condition. We analyzed the relationship between the participants' attitudes towards robots and the ratings of how genuine they felt the interaction was, and their rating of the robot's empathy in each condition. Finally, I'd like to thank our co-authors, Ashley and Maja, the NSF and the USC, as well as our volunteer actors, Brandon Tran and Isabel Reyes. Thank you.